Mutated by Joe McKinney. Narrated by Todd McLaren. Copyright 2012 by Joe McKinney. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Kensington Publishing Corporation and was produced in the year 2012. Hope bases vast premises on foolish accidents and reads a word where in fact only a scribble exists. John Updike. Pigeon feathers. What else could you expect from sending a man made of our common, tormented clay on a voyage of discovery? What else could he find? What else could you understand, or care for, or feel the existence of even? There was comedy in it, and slaughter. Joseph Conrad, An Outpost of Progress. Chapter 1. Ben Richardson jammed himself all the way to the back of the oven and watched the zombies stagger around in the rubble that had once been the lobby of a Pizza Hut. He wanted to kick himself for being so careless. His head had been elsewhere, and they'd caught him completely off guard. If he hadn't turned around when he did and spied them through the busted-out windows at the front of the restaurant, they'd have made a meal of him. But chain restaurants like this usually had canned food in their prep areas, and the promise of something other than pork and beans had been too much to resist. Stupid, he told himself, risking his life for a gallon of tomato puree. But he made the mistake, and now he had to own it. All that was left was to wait. Be quiet and wait. He silently let out a breath and relaxed his muscles, trying to get comfortable. No telling how long this would take. There were 3 of them out there, 2 older men and a young girl who looked like she might have been about 14. It was hard to tell for sure, though. The disease and the malnutrition disfigured them so, and, truth be told, he wasn't such a good judge of how old children were anymore. He saw so few of them these days. The zombies bumped into overturned tables and stopped as though confused when faced with padded booths and the overturned skeleton of the salad bar. The only sound came from the glass and fallen ceiling tiles crunching beneath their feet, but that could change at any minute. Richardson knew that from long experience. They always hunted in silence until they flushed something from the debris. Here, in the ruins of downtown St. Louis, that something would probably be a rat, or, if they were lucky, a dog or a cat. Once they cornered it, the moaning would start. It would begin as a soft, groaning sigh, but that would quickly swell to the breathy, almost desperate sobbing sound that Richardson had come to think of as their feeding call. It would carry for blocks, attracting more of their kind. Within moments, the infected would swarm the streets. Richardson had seen it happen too many times before. And so he waited, with a revolver in his left hand and a machete in his right, hoping these 3 would pass him by. Zombies were the ultimate opportunists, always on the lookout for an easy meal, but they lacked any sort of higher consciousness, and they certainly couldn't anticipate their prey's movements. As long as he stayed quiet and stayed in the dark, he'd be okay. "You're a roving camera," he told himself. "Just watch. Soak it all up." One of the zombies stepped in front of the oven, stopped, and slowly swiveled its head in Richardson's direction. For a moment, the zombie was framed by a faint golden nimbus of morning light. But then Richardson's eyes adjusted to the glare, and he saw the zombie clearly. The man had obviously fed recently. His shoulder-length hair was matted with deep arterial blood that had partially dried and looked like tar. Flies swarmed about his mouth and eyes, resting on his shaggy beard and on the soiled clothes that hung like strips of rags from his body. The smell of rotten meat brought bile to Richardson's throat. He studied the man's eyes. They were a milky white and threaded with cloudy pink lines. The eyes told him everything he needed to know. This was a Stage 1 zombie, probably only infected within the last 8 months or so with the necrosis filovirus, which caused the disease that had turned him into a zombie. He was slow and stupid, his brain charred to cinders by fever, and his body crippled by malnutrition. If he survived long enough for the disease to enter its second stage, and that was highly unlikely from all that Richardson had seen, he would evolve into something far more dangerous, faster, even capable of rudimentary teamwork with other zombies. But for now, the man posed little threat, as long as Richardson stayed quiet.
Just wait it out, he thought. Be a roving camera. He'll go away.
A sudden noise out in the street caught Richardson's attention. The sound of somebody running, breathing hard. A woman's voice, the words indistinct. Slowly, the zombie turned toward the noise. The other two did the same. A moment later, the moaning started. A chill crawled across Richardson's skin. Even after all these years, and all the time he spent telling himself he was just an observer here, none of this affected him. The feeding calls still made his bowels clench in fear. He saw a flash of movement off to his left. The zombies were already moving to the exit, going after whatever it was, and so Richardson inched forward to the edge of the oven and craned his neck as much as he dared around the corner. The restaurant windows had been busted out long ago, so that only shards of glass and dangling lengths of weather stripping hung in the frames. Through the window, Richardson had a view of the street outside, weeds growing up through the cracks, and beyond that, the ruins of North St. Louis. He wasn't exactly sure of the name of the street, and he supposed it didn't matter. All the streets of the world seemed to look the same now anyway. Thick with wrecked cars and blown trash, bleak canyons between buildings that had long since been reduced to windowless hulks, their insides gutted by scavengers and rotting from the weather. The zombies that had been inside the restaurant with him were moving off to his left, threading their way through a maze of cannibalized cars. Richardson could see a few more zombies emerging from an alley on the far side of the street.
"Hey! Over here!"
It was a woman's voice, coming from his side of the street. The three zombies stopped and slowly swiveled around to face the restaurant.
"Oh, no,"
Richardson muttered.
"What are you doing, you crazy fool?"
"Hey!" the woman yelled again. He inched back into the oven.
"You're a roving camera," he told himself. "Don't get involved. Choose the smart option, the one that lets you live."
But it had been days since he'd seen another person, and it got lonely out here in the wastelands. God-awful lonely. Well aware he was acting foolishly, he decided to chance it. He poured himself out of the oven and, keeping low, moved to his backpack resting against the wall by the building's side door. Richardson kept binoculars in there, but he didn't need them. The woman had stopped where he could see her easily enough. She was about his age, late 40s, early 50s maybe, slender, with frizzy gray hair pulled back in a loose ponytail that bounced between her shoulder blades like a tumbleweed on the wind. She carried a hunting rifle with a shoulder sling that she waved over her head like she was trying to flag the zombies down. Richardson was stunned.
"I know her. Christ, where do I know her from?"
He studied her profile, leafing back through the Rolodex in his head, trying to place her face. Where had he seen her before? Montana, maybe? There had been several thousand people living in a commune there years ago. Unbidden, thoughts of the 2 happy years he spent there rose up in his memory. Those 2 years, when Ed Moore and the others who had escaped Jasper Sewell's Grasslands cult were still alive, had been a sort of lull in the apocalypse. Ed had done everything right, and people had flocked from all over to enjoy the protection he offered. Straining his memory, Richardson went through the names of all the people he had known there in Montana, but he couldn't place the woman. But he did know her. He was positive of that. The zombies were getting closer to her now. Their feeding call was louder. Their sobbing had become urgent. The lead zombie raised his arms, his fingers clutching at the air, his addled brain unable to accurately perceive the distance to his intended prey. Then the woman put the gun down on the hood of a wrecked pickup, pulled a wooden baseball bat from a holster she carried on her shoulder, and charged the zombie.
"What the hell?"
Richardson said. The woman sidestepped the zombie, ducked underneath its clutching hands, spun around, and came up behind the man. Then she dropped him with a practiced swing to the back of the head, grunting loudly as the bat cracked the man's skull. She put the other two zombies down with the same precise movements, and Richardson figured she had to have done that move before. It was too quick, too precise, too practiced. Now she was looking around. Richardson scanned the parts of the street he could see, too.
"Don't get involved,"
he pleaded with himself.
"Stay out of sight. Be the roving camera that sees all but doesn't get involved."
But for once his curiosity overruled his common sense. This was crazy. What was she looking for? He couldn't figure it out. Richardson kept expecting her to run for it. She wasn't carrying any sort of gear except the bat and the rifle, and her clothes, though dirty, were in good repair. That meant she had to come from one of the compounds somewhere around here. There were 5 or 6 he had heard of. But she was definitely not a roadie like him. She had friends somewhere close by, and maybe even transportation. A bicycle, probably. The sounds of moaning in the near distance shifted his attention back to the other side of the street. It was just as he had feared. The frenzied feeding calls of the first 3 zombies had attracted more of their kind. He reached into his backpack and quickly extracted his binoculars. Scanning the rubble, he counted at least 18 zombies, but it was hard to be sure through the morning haze and the dust clouds rising off the vacant lots.
"Roving camera," he thought. "Time to get the hell out of here."
He returned the binoculars to his backpack and zipped it up. He was sliding the straps over his shoulders when the woman let out an ear-piercing whistle.
"What?"
Richardson blurted out, startled.
"No."
He pressed his body up against the wall next to the door, his pulse quickening as he chanced to look outside.
"She's gonna get herself killed,"
he thought. An excited moan rose from the approaching zombies. "Ah, shit," Richardson said. The woman whistled again, then turned to retrieve her gun, and in that instant something in his memory clicked into place. He recognized her.
"I can't believe it,"
he said under his breath.
"Sylvia Carnes."
8 years ago, shortly after Hurricane Mardell ripped the face off the city of Houston, and the zombies rose up from the soup of oil and chemicals in the floodwaters, Sylvia Carnes had been an English professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Those were wild, uncertain times. Nobody knew what to make of the infected. They were alive, and infected with a deadly virus, that was true. But did they have to be summarily executed? Didn't America have an obligation to find a cure? Everyone, it seemed, had ideas. Nobody had answers. The military was able to contain the outbreak behind a quarantine wall, built up to shield the rest of the country from the Gulf Coast and the affected areas of South Texas. And for a while, America was able to take a step back and ponder what it was supposed to do next. Diseases could be cured, couldn't they? Shouldn't they? There were many Americans with families still inside the quarantine walls. They lobbied hard for the government to offer some kind of relief. They wanted a cure, at the very least a vaccine. But there were others who were disgusted and outraged by all the stories of cannibalism and senseless violence coming out of the Gulf Coast region. Why not hold the zombies criminally responsible for the things they did, they argued. You didn't waive charges simply because a murderer claimed to have the flu. Why would you do it here, for this disease? Better yet, why not simply exterminate them before the plague they carried had a chance to spread? It had been a confusing time. A lot of people yelling. And Sylvia Carnes was right in the middle of it. She was a member of a radical group called People for an Ethical Solution. They wanted to show that the infected were still people who wanted and needed our help. This was not some bumbling, half-baked attempt at universal health care. This was a national crisis, and we had a moral imperative, Carnes said, to do everything in our power to find a cure, and to do it now. She filed a suit in a federal court, allowing her to take 40 of her graduate students into the ruins of San Antonio to prove her point. And it was a sign of just how crazy and uncertain those times were that a judge actually issued the okay for her to go inside the quarantine zone. At the time, Richardson was a reporter for The Atlantic, tasked to cover every aspect of the outbreak. He had walked the wall with guards from the newly formed Gulf Coast Quarantine Authority. He had interviewed hundreds of survivors from Houston and San Antonio. But he had never actually seen a zombie firsthand. He got his chance when he accompanied Sylvia Carnes and her students into San Antonio. At the time, he hadn't made up his mind about the infected. They weren't very well understood, and the idea that they could be cured appealed to his modern American sensibilities that everybody deserved a second chance, that it was somehow our moral obligation to extend a helping hand, even if there was a very real chance that it would get bitten off in the process. But after seeing zombies attack and kill all but one of Sylvia Carnes' students, his doubts disappeared. Their deaths clarified everything, put his views in focus. A concern for doing the right and honorable thing gave way to the realities of survival. He hadn't thought of that trip into San Antonio in a long time. A lot had happened since then. The Ben Richardson who went on that trip wasn't the same Ben Richardson who now crouched in the doorway of a ruined Pizza Hut, watching the rubble like a hunted animal. The world had changed. He had changed. And he hated that about himself. But she was looking at him. He stared at her, not blinking. Did she recognize him? She didn't seem to. She just seemed surprised to see another living person there.
"Run,"
she mouthed silently.
"Run!"
He didn't move. She hesitated for a moment, then looked over her shoulder at the zombies coming into the parking lot. Their moaning was much louder now. She looked back at him, no sign of recognition on her face, and said,
"Run, damn it!"
One of the zombies stepped on a large piece of glass, and the crack made Sylvia whirl around.
"Run!"
she said again, and then trotted off toward the back of the restaurant without giving Richardson another look. The zombies were almost even with the door now. Richardson could hear their feet shuffling across the trash-strewn pavement, their moans forming a chorus of strained, overlapping rhythms. Richardson pulled back into the shadows and held his breath. From where he stood, he could see a small section of the lot behind the restaurant. There was a 2-story red brick building there, with all the windows gone. Tall grass and sunflowers had grown up around the edges of the building, giving it a long, abandoned look. He wondered why Sylvia had run off in that direction. He'd come from those parts on his way into downtown, and he knew there was nothing of any value over there. Just more empty apartment buildings and quiet streets. So where was she going? And why was she trying to get the zombies to follow her? He couldn't see her anymore, and he couldn't hear her over the mounting feeding call. Zombies shambled into the grass at the edge of the lot, still moaning, arms dangling at their sides, heads canted to one side as though their necks weren't strong enough to hold up the weight. Out of habit, he counted them. 16 in all. He'd counted 18 before, so there were at least 2 more up near the front of the building. Richardson wanted to follow Sylvia Carnes, but he knew he had to think of his own survival first.
"Be the camera,"
he pleaded with himself.
"Don't be stupid."
Ducking back inside the restaurant, he went to the front windows and scanned the street. There was nothing there but ruined buildings and more wrecked cars. He couldn't see the other 2 zombies he'd counted earlier, and that bothered him. He listened, and when it sounded as though the moaning had receded, he holstered his pistol and his machete, grabbed his rifle, and headed out the side door in a crouch. He hugged the wall as he moved to the front of the building. There he stopped and scanned the street again. All clear. The air had a crisp, early-morning coolness to it, and he could smell the pungent earthiness of the Mississippi River less than a mile away. He glanced up at a large cloud bank overhead. He didn't think it would rain, but he had moved his poncho to the top of his pack before he set out that morning, just in case. Looking out at the street once more, he tried to get his bearings. There was a street sign about 50 feet to his right, hanging by a single screw from an overhead traffic light. The sign was covered in grime, but it looked like it read, "Florissant." He took the map from his back pocket and tried to figure out which way to go. He had heard of a trading market down near Herculaneum, and he figured he could get there by going south along the river. If he had his coordinates right, that meant going south from his current location to 14th Street, then east on Cole to Broadway, and from there he'd continue south to Herculaneum. It was going to be a long haul, 3 or 4 days maybe, depending on what he did or didn't encounter along the way. He pocketed the map again and stood up, just as a woman's voice sounded from the far side of the road. It wasn't Sylvia Carnes. This was the voice of a younger woman. He'd been conditioned by years of living on his own, surviving by his wits, to drop down into a crouch and look for cover at the first sign of trouble. He did that now. Off to his right, he could see the shell of an old supermarket, and across the street, a Church's fried chicken stand and a bank parking lot. Tall, spindly weeds grew up through the cracks in the asphalt. Richardson started looking for escape routes. He wouldn't be able to make it across the street without being seen, and that meant his only option was to go back the way he'd come, or go around the far corner, into the narrow gap between the Pizza Hut and the white concrete building next door. He'd been lucky once hiding inside the oven, but he knew he couldn't count on being lucky a second time, especially as all the noise was likely to make the place pretty popular here in a bit. He'd outlived everyone else he knew by playing it smart, and that meant not pushing his luck. Roving camera, he thought. Just be the camera. Staying low, he moved quickly along the front of the Pizza Hut and turned into the narrow gap on the far side of the building. He knelt down in the shadows and turned to watch the street. 4 people, 2 big guys with AR-15s and 2 young women in their 20s, were walking through the bank parking lot. The women looked like they were carrying hunting rifles. The men, one walking point, the other, who wore a St. Louis Cardinals baseball cap, trailing behind, were obviously the lookouts. They could be a scavenging party, he thought. But that didn't look right. Like Sylvia Carnes, their clothes were in good repair. Their shoes were fairly new and not held together with duct tape like his were. That meant they spent most of their time inside a compound. But a scavenging detail would have something to carry supplies in, like a horse-drawn truck or a shopping cart, or a sled of corrugated tin with a rope or a chain to drag it by. Maybe they were scouts for a larger party. Someone was running off to Richardson's right. The 4 people stopped and turned toward the sound. A moment later, Sylvia Carnes came trotting across the street. She went right up to the group. They obviously knew each other. The 3 women grouped together to talk. Sylvia Carnes was gesturing back in the direction she had come, and Richardson figured she had intentionally led the zombies away from the street in order to allow these 4 to move through in relative safety. That much made sense, at least. It was a risky strategy, but a proven one nonetheless. But what were they up to? He heard the sound of something hitting a hurricane fence off to his left. 4 zombies had emerged from between a pair of red brick buildings. The zombies were trying to climb the hurricane fence, which meant they were in stage 2, or maybe even stage 3 of the infection. They would be trouble. It was hard to fool them with a simple diversion. The guy walking point had already noticed them and was motioning the others to take cover. But he was too late. 4, then 6, then 9 more zombies entered the parking lot behind them, cutting off their retreat. Richardson spotted another 5 staggering toward them on a side street next to the church's chicken stand. He swallowed the lump in his throat as he scanned up and down the street. The infected were suddenly everywhere, coming from the alleys between the buildings and climbing over fences. When the moaning started, it was almost deafening. Richardson felt confused and frightened. How did this happen? Where had they all come from so suddenly? In the early days of the outbreak, the zombies had been able to fill a street like this instantly. He'd read Eddie Hudson's book about San Antonio right at the beginning of the outbreak, and at first he'd thought Hudson was just embellishing to make himself sound more embattled than he'd really been. But then, in Houston, he'd witnessed seemingly empty streets suddenly become as crowded as the hallways of a sports arena right after the game gets out. And that convinced him Hudson had been telling the truth. The zombies, especially stage 1 zombies, tended to mass together. Slow as they were, it was easier for them to make kills that way. But most zombies didn't survive the first few weeks of being infected. Between the injuries that made them zombies and the things they ate after they became zombies, very few lived the 8 or 9 months it took the disease to progress to stage 2. That was the main reason he decided to chance a walk through St. Louis. It would have been suicide to walk through the city in the early days of the outbreak, but he figured after 8 years he'd be okay. He realized now the folly of that decision. There were more zombies out on the street in front of him than he had seen in the last month combined. But where had they all come from? Sylvia Carnes and the others made a run for it. They crossed over to Richardson's side of the street and ran south, skirting behind the burned-out hulk of a car to block one of the zombies running their way. They were close enough now that he could hear one of the younger girls tell the 2 men to cover for them. She was the one in charge. Even a quick glance was enough to tell Richardson that. She wore a form-fitting gray sweatshirt, black BDU-style pants, and black combat boots. Her dusty brown hair was cut short. She gestured a command, and the party broke into 2 groups, the men remaining in place to cover the retreating women. A man whose arm had been chewed off above the elbow stepped into the street right in front of Richardson and started to moan. One of the men fired a 3-round burst into the man's chest, spattering the wall next to him with blood and wet clumps of lung tissue.
"That one right there,"
the woman in charge said. Both men were firing now, the street echoing with loud pops.
"Fall back that way,"
the woman said.
"There's too many of them,"
Sylvia Carnes said.
"Just go. Move."
Richardson lost sight of them in the commotion. The 2 armed men moved to either sides of a wrecked car and fired into the approaching zombies with well-disciplined shots. Richardson knew he had to get out of there. It was stupid to stay. There were way too many zombies out there now, and while these 2 guys were good, they weren't going to stop the flood. But where did the women go? Richardson scanned the front of the building to his right. He didn't see them. Richardson watched the zombies to see if any of them had changed direction to pursue the women, but none had. They were closing in on the 2 men, who were firing with everything they had now. It was only a matter of time for them. Richardson was left with a decision. He knew that. He could stay and play sniper and maybe help the 2 men, or he could turn and run. His instincts told him to run. The 2 men were toast, surrounded, no chance of fighting their way through. But at the same time, there was a part of him that refused to play into that logic. Richardson had traveled the country for the last few years, and he had seen survivors who thought they could eke out an existence by pretending to be one of the infected. Folks called them fakers, and they were disgusting sights, oftentimes looking every bit as zombie as the crowds of infected in which they moved. Their survival strategy was to abandon all sense of self, existing without purpose, without a future. Richardson had watched one such faker get mauled by a pack of the infected in a small town in Missouri, and the experience had left him with mixed feelings. The man had evidently lived for many months as one of the infected, for he had so completely given up his sense of self that he refused to cry out, even as the zombies tore the plumbing from his belly. Richardson's empathy had nearly made him throw up. But another part of him felt an obscene sense of vindication. After all, what kind of life had the man really had? Was he giving up anything worth holding on to? Richardson didn't think so. After all, anyone who would give up their sense of self was already dead, and running out on two people willing to fight to the bitter end seemed too much like giving up. Knowing he was going to regret this, he raised his rifle to his shoulder and lined up the sights on a zombie across the street. But even as he released his breath and flexed his finger on the trigger, the noise of a truck downshifting made him lower the rifle. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a working vehicle. What had it been, 8 months? A year? Long enough, certainly. And yet, here he was, looking at not one, but 4 pickup trucks advancing down a side street toward the two men. The trucks were matte black and rode on large, off-road tires. They were caked with white streaks that looked like bird shit, like they'd been parked under a tree full of grackles. And from their throaty exhaust notes, Richardson figured them for big block V8s, the kind of super-duty gas hogs he hadn't seen since before Hurricane Mardell wiped out the nation's domestic oil and gas industry. A few of the zombies turned toward the advancing caravan, but failed to get out of the way. The lead truck ran over one of the zombies and knocked several others to the side with its grill guard. At first, Richardson thought they were the cavalry for the two men in the street, but he could see now that wasn't the case. The two men looked terrified. It was plain as day in their expressions, and for a moment he thought the men might try to push their way through the zombies that had surrounded them. The lead truck swung a wide left into the street, the driver positioning the vehicle between the two men and the advancing zombies. The other 3, each of which was loaded with a squad of armed men in black shirts, fell in to the right of the first truck. As the two men watched, the black-shirted soldiers jumped from the trucks and surrounded them, their backs to the zombies as though they weren't even there. A man with a shaved, bullet-shaped head emerged from the passenger seat of the truck and walked behind the line of troops that had just climbed out of the trucks. Richardson stared at the man, mouth agape. He wore a ratty pair of jeans, no shirt, no shoes, and nearly every inch of his chest, arms, and face was painted a vibrant red. Thick black necklaces hung in skeins around his neck. From this distance, Richardson couldn't tell what was hanging from the necklaces, but whatever it was looked black and leathery. To Richardson, they looked like they might even have been dog turds. The red man moved slowly, limping slightly, his gaze on the zombies that were standing motionless only a dozen or so feet from him. His face had an odd, punched-in look to it. Richardson stared in disbelief. The zombies didn't attack. They didn't moan. They just stood there, swaying drunkenly, waiting, watching the red man like they were waiting for him to tell them what to do. "No way," Richardson muttered, shaking his head. "Not possible." The two men at the center of the red man's troops lowered their weapons, staring at the silenced zombies. "Drop your weapons!" one of the black shirts said. The two men looked at each other, their expressions sick with fear, but obeyed. They dropped their rifles to the ground. Then they slowly laced their fingers together behind their heads in surrender. Chapter 2. From his hiding place in the narrow alley next to the Pizza Hut, Ben Richardson watched in stunned silence. Sugar ants crawled across the toe of his right boot, but he didn't bother to wipe them away. A strong smell of rotting flesh drifted over him from the zombies in the street, but not even that registered. All his attention was focused on the man painted red. He was tall, and though he walked with a limp, he nonetheless moved with the unmistakable menace of a bird of prey hovering over a kill. The red paint that covered every visible inch of his body. It had to be paint, Richardson thought, not some weird form of rosacea. Glistened on his bald head and on his back, and when he turned toward Richardson, there was a self-amused smile on his face that betrayed a capacity for great cruelty and malevolence. Staring at him, Richardson felt a chill move over his skin. The two captured men were on their knees in the middle of the street, heads down, the black-shirted soldiers forming a ring around them. Even from 30 feet away, Richardson could see that the prisoners were trembling. The red man walked behind his soldiers, watching the two men, as though he were trying to make up his mind which one was the weaker. The zombies followed the red man with their eyes, never looking away, and it was their single-minded fixation on him that fascinated Richardson the most. He had seen plenty of Stage 3 zombies in the past 8 years. Some of them were even capable of limited cognition. They responded to their names. They were capable of delaying an attack, or working in teams with other zombies if it meant making a bigger kill. Once, years ago, in the flood ruins of Houston, he'd been part of a small group of survivors flushed from a building by some Stage 3 zombies, who were using a pack of Stage 1 zombies, the way English fox hunters used to use their dogs. He respected the threat they represented, but he had never seen anything like this. The red man seemed to have them under his complete control. He stepped through his line of soldiers and came up behind the man in the St. Louis Cardinals hat. He slapped the hat off the man's head, then grabbed his chin and turned his face toward him. The man panicked and tried to scramble away on his hands and knees, but the red man grabbed the back of his shirt, lifted him bodily into the air, and threw him face down onto the street. Richardson could see the man's eyes go wide. He could see the man's whole body shake. The other man tried to get away, but the troops grabbed him by the shoulders and held him down on his knees.
"Turn him this way," the red man said. "I want him to watch this."
The red man knelt down next to the prisoner, lowering his face so that he looked like a question mark bent over the man, who was kicking and thrashing for all he was worth now. The red man's eyes were vividly white against the red of his skin. He still wore a hideous, self-amused smile, though now he seemed to be smelling the man, drinking in his fear. One of the soldiers, his combat gear rattling against the nylon rigging he wore over his chest, ran up to the red man and stopped. He shook his head. "We didn't find them," the man said. "There are some tracks through the mud over there between those two buildings, but we lose them at the next street over." The red man didn't seem to acknowledge him. Instead, he made a sound that was part moan and part growl. The trooper glanced to his right and saw 3 zombies advancing into the inner circle. He stepped back quickly. The zombies stopped right behind the red man and waited, their eyes fixed on the back of his head. The captured man continued to kick and punch the air between the red man, but as desperate as he was, he couldn't break the grip that held him fast to the asphalt.
"Please," the man begged, "get them away! Jesus Christ, please!"
Richardson was breathing hard, a cold worm of dread burrowing its way through his bowels.
"Where is Nicky Booth?" the red man said. "You need to talk fast so you don't waste my time." "I never heard of her," the man said.
He was trying desperately to claw the red man's hands from the back of his neck.
"We're on our way to the trading outpost at Herculaneum." Jesus Christ, get those things away from me!
The red man leaned in close to the prisoner's ear and whispered something that caused the man to stop fighting for a moment, then to start up again, even harder. The red man grunted at the 3 zombies behind him, and they fell on the prisoner as though they hadn't fed in days. They tore at his back, at his ears, at his hands. The man's screams filled the street, echoing off the buildings. Richardson felt every single gut-wrenching sound, like somebody was jamming a needle deep into his ears. Richardson closed his eyes. He opened them when the screaming finally stopped, and he had to force himself to keep them open. The 3 zombies were feeding, the prisoner's body jerking as they bit into his back and arms and tore off strips of his flesh with their fingers. Moans went up from the zombies all around them, but none moved. The red man let go of the dead prisoner and stood up. He backed away slowly, his hands and arms dripping with the prisoner's blood. He was opening and closing his fists, breathing hard, almost like he was aroused, his tongue dancing on his lips. He never blinked. Richardson stared in confusion. He had long since resigned himself to the knowledge that men were capable of all manner of cruelty toward their fellow men. That wasn't what shocked him. It was the unmistakable control this man seemed to have over the zombies. How was that possible? The red man motioned to his black shirts to bring the other prisoner forward. They threw him down in the street a few feet from his dead partner and pinioned his arms and legs so he looked like a scarecrow dropped on his face. He kicked and thrashed, but couldn't move under the weight of 3 soldiers. The red man knelt down next to the man and shoved his bloody hand in his face.
"Stop," he said. "Stop now! Stop fighting!"
Richardson could see the veins standing out on the prisoner's neck. The man's face was taut with fear and rage. His lips were twisted into a grimace that showed his teeth.
"Stop it now!"
The red man stroked the back of the man's head, smearing blood into his dark hair. The man turned his face away.
"I want you to tell me now where Nicky Booth is. I know you know."
"Just kill me,"
the man said defiantly.
"I don't know who the hell you're talking about, and I'm never going to."
"Of course you know."
The red man paused a beat, then said,
"Look at me when I'm talking to you."
The man tried to pull away, his face still turned in the opposite direction. The red man grabbed the hair on the back of the man's head and twisted his head around, forcing the man to stare him in the face. The man kept his lips shut tight. He refused to cry out.
"That's better,"
the red man said. He touched a bloody finger to the man's cheek and ran it from his earlobe down to the point of his chin, leaving a dark smear behind.
"Now you're going to tell me what I want to know, okay?"
"You're insane. He was telling the truth. We're turkey farmers. We were headed down to the trading market in Herculaneum."
"You're no turkey farmer, not armed with brand-new AR-15s like these."
"We have to protect them from wild dogs and thieves."
"And where are these turkeys now?"
"We found a hog farm down by the river, north of town. We left them there."
"Why?"
"We wanted some vodka to celebrate for after we sold the birds. We were going to come back for them after we searched the liquor stores here in town."
The red man sat back on his haunches and sighed. The sunlight glistened off the thin layer of sweat that had formed across his back. There wasn't a hair on him, Richardson realized. Not a one. Just red paint slathered over every inch of skin.
"You try my patience,"
the red man said.
"My people have been following you since you left Ken Stoller's camp. I know you are with Nicky Booth. Now do not make me ask again."
Ken Stoller? Richardson wondered. Not the Ken Stoller. The same one Eddie Hudson had described in his book on San Antonio? The one who founded the People for an Ethical Solution Foundation that Sylvia Carnes and her doomed expedition to San Antonio belonged to. It couldn't be.
"Fuck you,"
the man said.
"Go ahead and kill me."
The red man wasn't smiling anymore. He slammed the prisoner's face down on the pavement and held him there, the heel of his palm grinding into the man's ear. The red man turned slightly and motioned to one of the black shirts. A soldier came forward, pulled a hunting knife, and handed it handle first to the red man. The red man took it, adjusted his weight on the prostrate prisoner, and then ran the tip of the blade around the back curve of the man's ear.
"There are a lot of ways to die, my friend. But you know what? You are not going to be given the luxury of any of them. You are going to have a long life ahead of you. And I fucking own it."
With a sudden, fierce effort, he jammed the tip of the blade behind the man's ear and cut it off with a few rapid back-and-forth sawing motions. The man screamed for a long time before fading off into a series of whimpers. The red man rode the writhing prisoner's back like he was on a startled horse, waiting for the man to stop moving. When at last he did stop, the red man let out a stuttering moan, and one of the zombies rose from the dead prisoner and approached where he waited by his master's shoulder. Richardson could see the zombie was missing an ear. Richardson scanned the motionless zombies that surrounded the red man, and saw that most of them were missing an ear. The skeins of leather necklaces around the red man's neck suddenly made hideous sense. "He's branding them," Richardson thought as a shudder went through him. "Like cattle." The red man stood up and cupped a hand under the zombie's chin. He forced the zombie's mouth open and then stuck his fingers in there, like he was rooting around for something. His fingers came away, dripping ropes of blood and saliva.
"What the hell?"
Richardson muttered. The red man knelt again next to the living prisoner and said,
"Tell me where Nicky Booth is. I won't ask again."
The prisoner's eyes went wide. He stared at the ooze dripping from the red man's fingers, shaking his head. His lips were clamped shut. Tears fell from his cheeks, and the muscles in his neck twitched.
"No? Okay, then. I want you to know you chose this," the red man said,
and he jammed his fingers into the man's mouth, smearing the gore on his gums and the inside of his lips. When the red man took his hand away, the prisoner dropped his face to the pavement and sobbed, defeated. Richardson thought he might vomit. He knew what the man's future held. Depending on his blood pressure and his overall health, he had anywhere from a few minutes to 4 hours of hell to look forward to. The necrosis filovirus would course through him, affecting his muscle coordination first. He would experience cramping and bloating. The muscles in his back and legs and neck would ache to the point that most men curled up in a fetal ball, unable to keep from crying. Next, his breathing would turn ragged, phlegmy, and he would start to smell like rotting food. He would cough constantly, sometimes bringing up big black wads of phlegm. Depersonalization would follow, and the more he lost of his personality and his memories, the more aggressive he would become. By the time the change was complete, there'd be nothing but a hollow husk remaining. Listening to the doomed man sobbing, Richardson could hardly breathe. The red man stormed across the road unexpectedly. He was looking to the east, where red brick apartment buildings were crumbling into streets thick with weeds and blowing sand. He wheeled around, studying the faces of the black shirts nearest him. None of them dared look him in the face. Only the zombies failed to shrink from him.
"They are on foot,"
the red man said.
"I know she hasn't gotten far. Search every street, every house, every shed until you find her. Then when you find her, bring her to me.
"I want her alive!"
Soldiers and officers exchanged nervous looks.
"Now!"
the red man snapped. His soldiers scrambled out of the street in their haste to leave. It was obvious to Richardson that they moved quickly not simply to obey his orders, but to get away from the violence gathering in his expression. As the soldiers started their search, Richardson watched the red man. The zombies stood like terracotta soldiers all around him, following him with their dead stares. In 8 years of wandering and collecting stories from survivors, and studying every aspect of the outbreak, Richardson had never even imagined that something like this was possible. If someone had told him about it, he wouldn't have believed them. Whatever this was, whatever this man represented, it was completely unprecedented. This was either a new beginning, or the worst sort of ending. He just didn't know which. He heard voices, and the sound of boots crunching through rotten wood coming from the other side of the building to his right, and he knew he had to leave soon. If he stayed here, they'd be on him in minutes. Slowly, praying his knees wouldn't crack and give him away, he rolled over onto his butt and climbed to his feet. He slid his back up against the wall of the Pizza Hut, and was making his way down the narrow gap between the buildings, when a zombie stepped around the corner, blocking his path. Richardson sucked in a breath. 3 more zombies rounded the corner behind the first, each of them missing an ear. The lead zombie extended his hands out toward Richardson, opening and closing his fingers like he was begging Richardson for something. The man's neck was bent to one side, the muscles in his face slack, the skin a jaundiced yellow. Flies swarmed around his head, and his clothes were so soiled Richardson couldn't tell what color they had once been. For a moment, Richardson was lost in the pale, white deadness of the man's eyes. He was still thinking of the downward slide the man out on the street was just beginning, and he wondered what, if anything, was left of the person this zombie in front of him had once been. Was there a part of him that still thought and felt and watched through those dead eyes, horrified by the murder and death that surely lay in its path? "I'm sorry for you," Richardson said, and drew his machete as the man began to moan. Chapter 3. Without warning, the zombie broke into a sprint, running straight at Richardson, arms outstretched. Richardson let out a startled gasp and slashed at the man with a machete. The blade glanced off the zombie's left arm, cutting into the meat but doing nothing to slow him down. His momentum carried him headlong into Richardson's chest, and when they hit, they both went tumbling over backward, landing in a pile of bricks and rotten plywood and tall weeds. The attack caught Richardson completely off guard. Watching the zombie's slow, staggering gait and jerky movements, Richardson had thought he was dealing with one of the slow ones, the recently infected. But they were face to face now, rolling around in the weeds and the busted lumber, the man snarling and snapping his teeth just inches from Richardson's nose, and he could see the threads of red veins in the eyes. He could see the intelligence, too. Anger and insanity and intelligence. This was a Stage 3 zombie, and he had tricked him by pretending to be one of the slow movers. He never would have let the man get this close if he'd known he was dealing with one of the smart ones. And, as the zombie managed to roll over on top of him, the stench of his fetid breath in his nostrils, Richardson had the terrible realization that the zombie must have known that, too. The man had tricked him. He grabbed the zombie under the chin and pushed his snapping teeth away with the heel of his palm. The man snarled like a fighting dog, a wet, snapping sound. His fingernails dug into Richardson's arms with unexpected strength.
"Get off, motherfucker!"
Richardson hissed.
"Come on,"
he told himself.
"You've got to fight. You've got to!
Grunting, bicycling his knees up into the man's gut, Richardson broke the zombie's hold on his biceps. He turned his head, looking for the rifle, and saw it partially buried in some tall weeds. He was just out of reach. He rolled over to his right, creating distance from the zombie, and scrambled to his feet. The zombie rolled off in the opposite direction, landing with his back against the wall of the Pizza Hut. He climbed to his feet easily and lunged for the machete in Richardson's hands. His fingers caught in the sleeves of Richardson's windbreaker, and for a moment they spun around an invisible pivot point as Richardson struggled to break loose from the man's grip. The other zombies were halfway down the alley now. Too close. He had wasted too much time. Pushing the zombie's hands up and out of the way, he kicked the heel of his right boot into the man's gut, knocking him backward. When the zombie came at him again, he swung the machete down on the man's outstretched hand and felt the blade whisper through bone. 2 fingers and part of the zombie's hand hit the wall of the red brick building with a dull thud and landed in the grass. The fingers curled toward the sky like the legs of an upturned crab. The zombie's arm dropped to his side, but otherwise the man showed no reaction to the damage. He continued forward. Richardson swung the machete twice more, hacking at the zombie's outstretched arms. Then he stepped to his right and brought the machete down on the zombie's head with a 2-handed overhead chop. The blade connected right above the man's missing ear and sank into the skull down to the top of the mouth. The zombie fell to his knees, bringing the machete with him. Richardson yanked at the machete's handle frantically, causing the dead body to jerk and twitch like a poorly handled marionette, but the blade wouldn't come free. The other zombies were too close. He felt one of them drop a hand on his shoulder, and he twisted away toward the front of the building. The zombies were grabbing onto his backpack, pulling him backward, but he was able to wrest free. Barely. He reached the rifle in the tall weeds and tried to swing it around like a club, but one of the zombies had closed the distance between them and was able to grab hold of the barrel and shake it back and forth so that Richardson couldn't gain control of it. The zombie managed to shift its grip forward and grabbed hold of Richardson's wrist. The gun and the zombie both fell to the ground as Richardson pulled himself loose, and he found himself standing over the zombie. The zombie was on his knees, reaching for him, as Richardson backed away. The other zombies were still a few feet behind the one on its knees, but they were close enough to keep him from retrieving his gun and his machete. Still backing up, Richardson slipped on one of the bricks and nearly lost his footing. He reached down and scooped up a brick, and smashed it down with both hands on the kneeling zombie's face, the brick connecting with a muffled clank, and then crumbling. He let the ruined bits fall from his fingers. He was out on the sidewalk in front of the Pizza Hut now, stunned by what had just happened to him. In 8 years of fighting the infected, he had never seen one use such a complicated ruse as pretending to be a slow mover. The implications of that were staggering. Richardson turned away from the 2 remaining zombies, looking for a place to run, and froze when he saw the red man watching him. The red man had been kneeling at the body of the dead man in the St. Louis Cardinals hat. But when he saw Richardson, he stood up and took a few steps forward. There was no self-assured smile on his face now, just a steady, unyielding stare. He stepped forward again, eyes narrowed on Richardson. Behind him, Richardson heard footsteps in the grass. He glanced quickly over his shoulder and saw the 2 zombies coming out of the alley. When Richardson looked back to the street, the red man was pointing in his direction. Then the red man threw back his head and began to moan. The zombies in the street all turned their heads in Richardson's direction. He made a quick scan of the street, all those dead eyes looking at him, and he swallowed. One of the red man's soldiers fired at Richardson, hitting the wall behind him, peppering the back of his neck and scalp with bits of brick and mortar. He ducked his head and ran. Behind him, he heard the hacking cough of automatic weapons. The air around his head filled with high-pitched whines, like a swarm of invisible hornets. Bullets tore into the facade of the Pizza Hut, blasting off bits of wood and brick that sizzled against the sleeves of his windbreaker. He rounded the corner where he had first seen Sylvia Carnes and veered to his left as the wrecked car ahead of him exploded beneath a hail of bullets. 4 zombies were staggering toward him from the overgrown alley behind the Pizza Hut. Richardson veered to the right of a pickup to avoid a zombie and kept on running, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. There was a ruined wooden fence to his right that ran the length of the property back to the alley, bright green weeds growing along the base. Without breaking stride, he pulled his pistol and fired at the zombie that stepped around the back corner of the fence. The zombie sank to its knees, but didn't fall. A moment later he was in the alley, facing another crumbling wooden fence and a 3-story apartment building beyond that. He looked to his left and saw 2 zombies coming at him through the grass. On the next street over, he heard the sound of a truck engine revving loudly, coming closer. To his right, the alley was thick with trash and weeds. A wooden light pole had fallen across the alley, and it was covered with what looked like lilac. Beyond the pole was a zombie in the remnants of a red T-shirt and jeans, staggering clumsily over a mounded pile of garbage. Tires skidded on the pavement behind him. Men shouted. Again he heard the stuttering cough of automatic weapons, the bullets slapping into the brick wall to his right. He moved to the opposite side of the alley and ran toward the fallen light pole. His chest was heaving, his breath hitching in his throat. But he forced himself to stop, breathe, and focus on putting his pistol's front sight on the zombie's chest. Richardson fired twice, dropping the zombie, before ducking under the light pole and running through the trash-strewn alley. He made it to the next corner and turned left. A long gray street stretched out ahead of him, the concrete cracked into oddly symmetrical squares and choked with weeds and rolls of carpet, insulation panels, soggy paper, plastic bags, and endless piles of concrete scree and lumber. To his left was a 6-story brick building with nearly every window broken. To his right was the fossil of a parking garage, its gray concrete frame cracked and crumbling. Shrubs grew from the ledges. The bottom story had been walled up with a mismatched assortment of bricks, parts of the wall covered with the faded ghosts of graffiti from before the outbreak. One section of the wall had collapsed, creating a way in, and he ran for it.
"There he is!"
came a man's voice from behind him. Richardson turned and saw one of the black trucks turning the corner behind him. A soldier standing up in the bed was banging on the roof of the cab and pointing right at Richardson. "Damn it," Richardson muttered. He ran for the collapsed section of the wall and dove inside it as the truck roared to life and started down the alley. Inside the parking garage, he suddenly found himself in near total darkness. Here and there he could make out the silhouette of wrecked cars, and he could smell the rancid odor of a dead body propped up against the wall to his right.
"He's in there,"
a man's voice said. Richardson spun around and faced the patch of sunlight that led back out to the street. 2 man-sized shapes appeared in the opening. He pulled his pistol and fired. One of the men let out a grunt, like he'd been punched in the gut. The other ducked back behind the corner.
"Choke on it, asshole,"
Richardson said. He ran for the opposite side of the building, found a stairwell, and ran down it. He emerged onto another ruined street, a tall chain-link fence straight ahead of him. He ran for the fence and found a section that was peeled back from the post, and he pushed his way through the hole into the overgrown alley beyond. The alley was little more than an easement between 2 brick buildings. He had to turn his shoulders to fit through. On the far side of the easement he saw